Okay, well, my name's Susan McNally. I live in Pennsport, which is in South Philadelphia. And about 20 years ago, I got interested in my genealogy, even more interested because I found out that my two grandparents, one from Germany, one from Ireland, came into America on Pier 53, which is 8 blocks from where I live. I had no idea. Pier 53 was the Ellis Island in Philadelphia. So I started doing research and asking around, and I found a lot of people who lived in the neighborhood who also had ancestors that came in through Pier 53, and they had no idea that Pier 53 was right within walking distance of where they lived. There's this sort of mystery. So I want to get into that, study the history of it, and then really got into the stories of the immigrants and the immigrant experiences. Some of those experiences are reflected on the bios on your passenger tags. All very interesting stuff. Okay, this is the corner of Columbus Boulevard, also known as Delaware Avenue, and Washington Avenue. It's in South Philadelphia. On the left is the Coast Guard Station, and on the right is the Steelworkers Union building. And the pathway you see leads to a park in the back, and that's Pier 53. This is right on the Delaware River. And that's what the pier looked like in 1912, and that's exactly where it was. And now a brief history. Pier 53, where are you? How come that's cut off? Frank, do you know why?
No.
Oh, of course. Okay, thanks. All right. Yeah. There we go. Okay, yeah, much better. Thank you. Pier 50, nobody really knows where Pier 53 is, and I hope in the future that will change as it becomes better known. There it is. It's sheet metal between the Sheet Metal Workers Building and the Coast Guard Station at the foot of Washington Avenue and Columbus Boulevard. The history of the area goes back to William Penn's treaty with the Lenape Indians, who I understand lived up around here too, right? They had covered a lot of territory. Because it was on the river, originally it was a battery, and it was to keep the British ships from coming up the Delaware River and hitting Philadelphia, which they did at one time. But Philadelphia was run by Quakers in the 18th century, so they didn't really want to hear anything about armaments or guns or anything. So Ben Franklin said, "Now we really got to start thinking about this." Well, the Quakers said, "We're not going to give you any money for a battery." So he started a lottery, and with the money he won from the lottery, he outfitted the garrison. And it was originally 27 guns, and then it was expanded to 50. So right where Pier 53 is now, there were guns that were pointed down the river in case any British decided to come up and visit. And up to 1800, the Joshua Humphreys shipyard, they made the tall-masted ships here. And at one time, they were the tallest buildings in the city. And it became, they built the USS, United States frigate, which was a huge ship. And when it was launched, it created like a little tsunami in the neighborhood. It was so heavy. They were fought in the War of 1822, or the War of 1812. And by the 1840s, Philadelphia was a major port, one of the largest in the world. The port, the city really didn't expand further south than around Federal Street, which is right in the middle of South Philly. It didn't go further south. Further south were Swedish colonies, interestingly enough, and spent small farms. But the city itself, as you can see, was pretty dense. And there were two islands in the middle of the Delaware River, which were plowed under eventually because ships, big freighters and steamships would come up and they had to go around the islands. So you see, if you see any early maps of Philadelphia, you'll see these two islands. And then the Navy Yard. This was the first Navy Yard in the United States. And it lasted until 1876. You see the shipbuilding areas are still there. But the Navy Yard was taking in all kinds of ships, and they were also bringing in immigrants. So you could have landed, if you came from Europe, you could have actually landed at the Navy Yard. It wasn't yet an immigrant station, although it became one later. (1801 to 1876). It was eventually sold. The entrance to the yard was at the foot of Federal Street during the Civil War. During the Civil War, get into that. It was railroad network was being built, and this was also a big shipbuilding area. They had wooden ships. The Navy Yard grew to 11 acres in size and included the shipbuilding, and then increasingly railroads were put in. During the Civil War, because of its location and because of the railroad, Civil War soldiers were brought upriver. They bivouacked at Pier 53, what was Pier 53, Columbus Boulevard and Washington Avenue. And then they were marched a mile up the road to the B&O station. They got on trains and they went to the Battle of Richmond. You don't think of Civil War soldiers taking a train to go to a battle to fight, but that's what they did. But they started out at where Pier 53 is now. And there were refreshment stations. After they came back, the wounded soldiers were bivouacked in that area. There was a Marine hospital nearby. And some of them recuperated, but there were these tents and there were these comfort stations that were set up by the local people, by women whose husbands had possibly been killed in the war, and housewives, and they made sandwiches and they made coffee for a whole bunch of people, Civil War Union soldiers who were coming back. Large numbers of regiments. Some regiments had as many as 900 men. Were served by the stations. It's estimated that over 200,000 meals were served during the course of the war. So it was a big Civil War encampment. And then the train station was right in front of the camp. So after the war was over, these people would just be put on trains and they would be sent south or north or west. The trains were already there. It was a great location, sort of a central station to get people and then send them back to where they came from. This is a photograph taken in 1870. The immigration station. This is the beginning of Pier 53. It was called the Emigrant Station at the time, E-M-I-G-R-A-N-T. And it was all by itself. It was on the river. There were railroad tracks everywhere. The Pennsylvania Railroad purchased the property from the Navy Yard from the federal government for $1 million, which was a big mark in that. And then it was used, they really repurposed it into an immigration station. It became the largest one in Philadelphia. And it had been already an immigration station. But the Pennsylvania Railroad realized that in addition to being a freight depot, it was also a great place to welcome immigrants who also had access to the trains. So it became the primary immigrant station, or emigrant station as they called it at the time, for Philadelphia. And here's pretty much how it looked. The train ran right in front of the building. There were 3 steamship lines that had aligned themselves with the Pennsylvania Railroad. The American Line, the Red Star Line, and the Hamburg American Line. And they had sort of intake facilities on the river, but everyone ended up going through the station and then out the front and onto where the trains were. And this is what the inside looked like. This is in the 1880s. It changed in the 1890s and became a two-story building. And it was electrified. They didn't have electricity here. But it was a place where you could meet your relatives who were coming in. You could hire a cart with horses. You could, see, in this case, change money. You could have a meal. You could send a telegram to the people, your family who might have been there and might be waiting, that you were here. In fact, the telegram was used in there's a big telegraph station there. When people came upriver, they stopped at a station, a quarantine station called Lazaretto. There were actually 3 Lazarettos through the history of Pier 53. The first one was in Essington, and that's probably the best known. People call it the Lazaretto, but Lazaretto actually is a name that means a place of quarantine. So there's a Lazaretto. It's a common noun. But the Lazaretto had, you could send telegrams. So the telegram would be sent to Pier 53 saying, our ship is at the Lazaretto, which is 7 miles downriver, and we're coming up, and we'll probably be docking at such and such a time. And then the telegram would be sent to the people who were waiting for a relative would be coming in, and then they knew when to meet the ship. And then trains would take you everywhere. The Pennsylvania Railroad had a monopoly on the trains that ran around there. There was also the B&O station, Baltimore and Ohio, which went up along the Schuylkill River. And there were other short line railroads that ran along the pier and just did delivery of freight along the piers. But the Pennsylvania Railroad, that was the big daddy. This is what the outside of the stations looked like. The Immigrant Passenger Depot. I don't know why they use the word immigrant, because I was always told in school that there was a big difference between the word immigrant and immigrant. An immigrant is people leaving, an immigrant is people coming in. So if it's an immigrant station, it means that it's receiving people who are leaving from somewhere else. But if it's an immigrant station, it means people who are coming in to be here. So when it was changed in 1876 and it became the immigrant station, immigration station, it wasn't an immigration station, it meant, I think, psychically it probably meant that people, the Philadelphia was much more accepting of people coming in, that they weren't escaping from somewhere else, they were coming in to become citizens. It's much more welcoming, just by the change of that one word. And here's how it worked out. This is from 1887. This was an engraving by Pennsylvania Railroad. And it was used sort of as advertising to show how everything worked. There were multiple piers, and they all went with elevated walkways into the immigration station. And they came in. One says the Red Star Line, one says the White Star Line. There were freight piers as well, and there were railroads everywhere. The big building here was actually a granary. It looks like everything is going into the granary, but the station, the immigration station, was much smaller and only 2 stories high. There were big buildings along the river that weren't factories. They were granaries and warehouses. This is from an 1870 photograph taken from a shot tower, which is a tower a few blocks away, that did incredible pictures. The man took pan shots of all of Philadelphia. So you had a 360-degree view of what Philadelphia looked like in 1870. And this was looking down at the immigration pier. The big building that you see next to it is actually what was left of the shipbuilding. But this is what it looked like. And then the railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, built wharves and granaries for the freight that was coming in, but then they also built the renovated this building. Some of the immigrants stayed in the city, many took the trains that left directly from the station and traveled west, north, and south. And that's how a lot of people from Philadelphia came out here, who took the train out here. A lot of trains went out to Scranton, they went out to Cleveland, to Cincinnati, and then you would transfer, and some of the immigrants who came into Philadelphia ended up in Nebraska. It's amazing. And that's another story. That's the story of the Volga Germans and the escapees from Russia. Another story. This is what the neighborhood looked like. This is the station. And they walked into a really, really crowded neighborhood. This is Southwark. It's called Southwark. And Southwark now encompasses Queen Village and Pennsport. They're two separate neighborhoods. But this was considered Southwark, and it's, I guess this would be Queen Village now because this would be Washington Avenue. It's north of Washington Avenue. And it had an incredible density. Fitzwater to Christian, Broad Street east of the Delaware River, part of what is now known as Southwark, had a density of 130,000 people per square mile. I mean, that's hard to imagine. It's like Bangladesh. Here's what it looked like. Here are all the railroads. It was dominated by freight lines and depots. You can see the immigrant station. It's called the Immigrant Station now, okay, in 1895. And here it is in 1910, I believe. If you came from they call it the Immigrant Station here. If you got out of the immigrant station and walked towards the neighborhood, you'd have to trudge over about a quarter of a mile of railroad tracks. So the tracks just dominated Columbus, what's now Columbus Boulevard, Delaware Avenue. And then trains ran up Washington Avenue. I live not too far from here, and Washington Avenue now has, up until a few years ago, been thought of as a major thoroughfare because there used to be tracks in the middle of the of the street. And the tracks aren't there anymore, so they're going to narrow the street and make it more pedestrian friendly and make it safer to travel because people were going like 50 miles an hour and then they'd reach the traffic light and then they'd stop. And then they'd go 50 miles an hour and another traffic. So it's now being reconfigured so that people will do that. It's going to be more passenger and pedestrian friendly, which is great. The names of the three steamship lines that came into Pier 53 were noted on the facade. And here's the facade. More about the t-shirts later. American Line, Red Star Line, Hamburg American Line. These were the three steamship lines that came into Philadelphia. So if you're doing research into your family and you want to know if they came in to Philadelphia, if they came in on one of these three lines, they came into Pier 53. There were other lines that came into Philadelphia, the Italia Line, for instance, which came from Naples, and that came in further north, at Pier 9 North. But American, Red Star, and Hamburg American. At one point, the White Star Line, because the American line had been built by the White Star Line and went back to the American line again. Another was the Norddeutscher Lloyd Line that came from Bremen, and another line was the Allen Line, which came from Glasgow, Scotland. But these were the three main feeders to Philadelphia. And then the Great War, 1917 to 1919. Passenger service had pretty much stopped from Europe for obvious reasons. And a lot of the passenger ships had been turned into troop ships. So at the end of the Great War, all these troop ships came in, one of which was the Haverford, the SS Haverford, which was like the bulk bus of Irish and English immigration. It came from Liverpool, Queenstown, right to Philadelphia, and it made bi-monthly trips, and it was just like a shuttle between the two cities. A lot of Europeans came, actually. They came into England, took a train to Liverpool, and then went from Liverpool to Philadelphia. But it was, they were turned into troop ships, and then they went back into passenger ships. But in 1919, it says, back from France, first stop Philadelphia. This is a poster in a Rota Reviewer public ledger building, Sunday Rota Reviewer section. And it's really great. I have the original. I had it scanned it and changed it in Photoshop. I think this is probably the only image that still exists because it was in an original 1919 newspaper, which I happen to have. We had last year, well, no, this was 2019, so our last big bash before COVID hit. We had a big 100th anniversary celebration of the Haverford coming in on Pier 53, right at that pier. And we hired a brass band who played nothing that had been written after 1919. We gave out 48-star flags. And it was really great. It was a big, here we are. It was exactly the same date, exactly 100 years later. And it just happened to fall on a Saturday, which is great. In 1915, the original immigration station building was demolished because starting in 1892, Covent Garden, Ellis Island, started bringing in a lot more people, and it was a much larger facility. Plus, it was closer to Europe. There's, when you think, well, we're here, and then Europe is over here, but Europe is what we think of as Europe. It's really pretty far to the north of where we are. We're south. We're 40 degrees meridian, and European ports are like 51, 53 degrees north meridian. So they're really far. They had not only crossed the ocean, but they had to go south. To get to Philadelphia from the sea, you had to go south and then come into Philadelphia by way of Cape May, Cape Henlopen, and Delaware Bay, and then up from Cape Henlopen up to Philadelphia, which is 100 miles. I mean, hard to imagine, but it's 100 miles. If you just follow the Delaware River to the ocean to Cape May, it's 100 miles if you got in the boat and traveled. So it took a day. So it was an extra day traveling. Plus, they had to go further south. So Ellis Island became a lot more popular because it was closer. So it was 2 days closer. After the 1920s, immigration slowed for a variety of reasons, some of which were immigration laws and taxes that were put on immigrants. And it was decided that we really didn't need immigrants anymore in Philadelphia. Plus, there was a suspicion of sabotage that came about through people doing nasty things during the First World War. So we had a lot of people like Bolsheviks were coming in. And the arguments at that time were so familiar to what's going on now. They're just almost identical. You could almost plot the line, if this happens, this happens, this will happen if this happens. So it really became a municipal pier. The city ran it. And during World War II, it was a place where they shipped a lot of machinery and things, because we had a lot of factories, a lot of stuff in Philadelphia, and that shipped out of Pier 53 down the bay and over to Europe. And then, in 1965, suddenly, a tragic fire of mysterious origin burned the 700-foot-long structure. There were oil drums that were stored in. It hadn't been used, really. Most of the shipping had moved further south to where it was a lot closer to the entrance to the Delaware Bay, and the Navy Yard didn't move south. So this just burned up. And then between 1965 and 2008, nothing. It was left to ruin. Things rotted. Nobody was allowed to go there. And they put in I-95, isolating the river from the city, and Columbus Boulevard was widened, and it was almost impossible to get to the river if you were walking from the neighborhood. You had to climb over what was left of railroad tracks and rubble, and then if you wanted to see the riverfront, you had to claw through cyclone fences just to be able to walk along the river. And many of the piers were very dangerous. I had a neighbor who, as a kid in high school, used to dive off of the abandoned piers. The kids would, after school, they would come and they would dive off these piers. They'd have to claw through. There, this is what it looked like. It still looks like this. It was described by a reporter, and they were thinking of putting a casino down there as the retreating, I love this, the retreating glacier of Philadelphia's industrial past. And then in 2008, the city started to rethink the whole concept of the riverfront, and they saw what was happening in other cities. That there's pride in their riverfront. You know, in Baltimore, and I went to a conference, and there was a man from Venice, Italy, and he was talking about how they treasure the water, and all the city fathers were sitting there going, he said, this city is the only city that has a Walmart on the river. You know, what are you thinking? So Washington Avenue Green Park, as it was then called, still is, was owned by the city. The city owned little parcels along the river, but the whole area of the river was owned by different real estate developers. And in some cases, nobody really knew who owned it because it was a holding company, and they were holding it for a while, and then they were going to flip it, you know, resell it, and it was valuable. Maybe someday it'll be valuable. Maybe someday the city would realize that the riverfront was a real asset, and the value would go up. And they'd hold it for a couple of years, and then they'd flip it. And they were going to build a casino there. It was going to be, I remember one time, many years ago, it was going to be a dump for auto parts right on the river. Now, what happened, because they left the site untouched, when the municipal pier burned down, they just took the rubble and pushed it out into the water where the pier had been. And what was left were rotted piers, so there was just rubble between the piers, and they just left it there. And all of a sudden, mulberry trees appeared on the site. And mulberry trees are not indigenous to the United States, so the mulberry seeds were brought in and had been lying dormant from ships that were coming in from other places, and here they were. We also have right on the site a Polonia tree. Does anyone know anything about Polonia trees? They're Chinese. They grow enormous size. Like in 20 years, you have a fully blown tree.
If your casket is made out of Polonia tree, you go right to heaven. There's no, it's instant. That's what the oil looks like.
And also a Chinese family that has a girl, on the day she's born, they plant the seed for a Polonia tree.
Yeah.
And then when she's 20 and ready for marriage, she has a whole tree. They can cut it down and make furniture for their daughter. It grows that fast. Well, anyway, there are these Polonia trees. You know, they're growing right along the side of the river. Nobody knows how they got there. But obviously they came in shipments from China. The Polonia seed pods, are like carefully wrapped. They look like these little shrink-wrapped hexagonal, three-dimensional, I don't know what they call them, hexagons, I guess. And inside the pod is what looks like K-pop. And it was used for packing. So the seeds to the Polonia tree may have come over in packing crates. We don't really know. But anyway, there were Polonia trees all along the river. Nobody knew how they got there. Nobody knew how the mulberry trees got there either. But I think that's kind of neat. And the original waterfront that had been part of a naval yard, the immigration station, had been abandoned. Shipping and marine went further south. The Navy Yard moved to League Island, where it is now. Piers collapsed and rotted. And that's what they look like. I took this a few weeks ago, just off of Pier 53. Now, in 1972, there was the Clean Water Act that went into effect, and it regulated chemical effluents. What was happening up in Bristol, there were a lot of factories. It was a bleach factory, Purex bleach, and they were dumping the product that they didn't need into the river, and it would just go south, it would go right down the river. So we kill all the fish. It was a terrible, foul-smelling place. Nothing lived in the Delaware River. So the Clean Water Act was passed, and said you can't do that anymore. You can't bury chemicals in your backyard. You can't dump stuff into the river. So the river started clearing up, and getting healthier, and the fish started coming back. But the cleaned up Delaware River, which had formed this film around the wooden piers, which protected them from decaying, suddenly wasn't there anymore, and the pier started to rot. So it wasn't until after the Clean Water Act had been passed that these piers started to rot. In 1976, during the bicentennial, Philadelphia began to become very self-conscious about its history. And a sign was put up right at Delaware and Columbus Boulevard saying, hey, this is where the immigration station was, right here. Like, nobody knew. In 2004, when the city hired Applied Ecologic Services, they were given a contract to evaluate and renovate the pier. Well, let's see if we can do something with this. And, how important is it, and how safe is it? Can people walk? People were walking out on the pier all the time, and in fact, there were people that camped there. They would set up campsites and fires and everything on this pier, but it wasn't really safe. It was kind of squishy, and at high tide there'd be these little pockets. So these people came in and they said, well, we can pave over a little bit. We can't do the entire length of the pier because that's really badly rotted. We can work something up to a certain point, and that will be solid, and we'll give pedestrian access and wheelchair access, and everything will be cool. So once they started working on it, and they found the Paulownia seeds, and they found the mulberry trees, and then they found out this was the immigration pier. Amazing. And then a lot of the people that were working on this said, hey, my grandfather came in on this pier. Who knew? Here I am working on this place. I didn't know that I was descended from somebody who came from Europe, right here. So this knowledge informed the design of the pier. Jody Pinto, who is a sculptor who's Philadelphia-based, but she lives in New York now, designed a thing called a landboy, which is a sculpture at the end of the pier. This is the end of where you can actually walk. And it's brilliant. It marks the landing place of approximately 1 million immigrants. And it has two purposes. Well, the purpose is that it's a monument, but it references 2 points in Philadelphia history. One, it's a landboy where you could actually go to the top. It's 24 feet. When you go to the top of the pier, you're 24 feet above the street level. You can sort of look down the river. And symbolically, you can see ships coming in. You can pretend you're an immigrant waiting for your sister to come in, and you can look down the river. But also, it's a spiral staircase, and it's reminiscent of a lot of the staircases that were in Father, Son, Holy Ghost houses in Philadelphia, where immigrants moved in. They could have actually afforded a small house, but they always had a spiral staircase in the middle of the house. And at 24 feet, you were on the 3rd floor. And you can see it at night. It's got a solar panel. You can see it from the river. It's really great. And here's what it looks like taken from the bridge of a ship by one of my neighbors who's a river pilot. And he was sailing from the Tioga terminal downriver, and he took a picture of what it looks like. We have some drone shots. I can't really access them, but somebody actually went out here with a drone and took these really great pictures. But this is the best one we have of the whole thing. And the immigrants. Look at these wonderful faces. Where did they come from? Who are they? Where did they go? Well, some of them stayed and some of them went somewhere else. The steamship routes to Philadelphia, 1870 to 1920. Hamburg, Glasgow, Southampton, Naples, Liverpool, Queenstown, and they all came into Philadelphia. But the ones leaving from Northern Europe, like, Glasgow and Liverpool, they had to come pretty far south to get to Philadelphia. And here are the latitudes, meridians. Hamburg is at 53.55 north. And Cape Henlopen is at 37.35 north. So that's a big distance from north to south. Plus they had to go across the ocean. So it was a big trip. They lasted, the Haverford, which was sort of a shuttle that went from Liverpool to Philadelphia. It was like the bulk bus of Irish immigration. It was like, would take 14 days. It would come down, it would be like 12 days, and then it would stay in port for 2 days, and then take passengers and bring them back up to Liverpool. So it would be like 2 trips a month, regularly. If you missed the trip that was leaving July 1st, you could probably get it on the 20th in Liverpool. And Liverpool is 53.41 north, and Philadelphia, well, they'd have to go down to 37.35, but Philadelphia is like 40. So it's quite a distance. And it took 12 days, sometimes 14 days, depending on the weather. One thing I found, a record I found, it said, passage, 7 days! Exclamation point, exclamation point. They had really good weather. They had the wind at their back, all these wonderful things. And they made it in 7 days. It was a record. I think the SS United States made it in 5 days. That is the record now for crossing the Atlantic. But the Haverford, one of the ships, they did it in 7 days. They used to, before steamships, there were, and up until into the 20th century, there were hybrid ships. They were steamships. They were powered mostly by steam, but they also had big sails. So when they were crossing the ocean and the winds were favorable, they would just use the sails. But when they came into the Delaware Bay, which was very iffy, navigation was very iffy, the Delaware Bay, because of the sand, moving sand was there, they would use the steamship power. Where did they come from? In 1876, Europe was very good. There were no Finland, there was no Poland. Both countries had been absorbed by Russia. They want to go back and take them back. Ireland, Scotland, and Wales were all considered part of England. They were the UK. You lived in Ireland, you lived in Limerick, you lived in the UK, the United Kingdom. You weren't Irish. There was an Austrian-Hungarian Empire and an Ottoman Empire, which was huge. And then, in 1926, after the First World War, there now existed Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Austria. Hungary were 2 different countries, not Austria-Hungary, they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Poland reemerged as a separate country, and the south of Ireland became the Irish Free State, and Northern Ireland is and still remains part of the UK. And the Ottoman Empire had just vanished, wasn't around. Now, immigration laws. In 1883, the U.S. Department of Justice, and this division later became the Department of Immigration, they said, well, all these people are coming in to America, and we really don't know who they are, and they tell us we're from Germany or Poland or something, but we have determined that there are different races of people. They didn't put it in quotes. Race or people. Like there were these, like Serbians belonged to a race. Macedonians were part of a race. The Greeks were part of a race. And we should make the distinction as to who these people are, just to keep a record of who these people are when they're coming into America. I think that was important. So anyway, where did they come from? 1881, 1882 was the Chinese exclusion laws, which everybody knows about. They were coming into the East Coast, they were coming into the West Coast. After 1882, immigrants were barred from entering the U.S. if they presented with medical conditions. That's why the lazaretto would find these people that had trachoma. Hernias were a big thing. If you had a hernia, maybe you really wouldn't be able to find a job once they landed you in America, and you'd be a public charge. If you were a child traveling alone, you had to have somebody there to meet you, because otherwise you would just be an orphan and you would become a public charge. they didn't want you to be a public charge. Any immigrant restrictions by country, origin, and period applied only to Asians. Only to Asians, but then it tightened up a bit. Unstable political conditions in southeastern Europe. This included Italy, where there were famines, and then southeastern Europe, where the pogroms had started. Encouraged immigration to the United States. And immigration occurred in increasing numbers from countries such as Russia and Italy. And they outnumbered the immigrants who would come earlier from Western Europe. The big time of Irish immigration was from the 1880s up till about 1900 and 1900. You see the records and the manifests. All these people are coming, and they all are coming from Czech names and Italian names. They're all from Southern and Eastern Europe. So there was such an influx of these people that people got a little suspicious. They didn't want all these foreigners who didn't speak English. 1970, Japanese government voluntarily limited Japanese immigration to the U.S. in the Gentleman's Agreement. Philippines was an American colony, so we let them in. And then 1913 saw the greatest volume of immigrants coming in to Philadelphia. I think something like 250,000 people came in 1 year. And then in 1917, have you ever heard of the, what was his name, John Jackson? Who wrote about the frontier, the American frontier? And it was this Frederick Taylor Jackson, was his name. And he said, in 1910, he wrote this essay saying, the American frontier no longer exists. We don't have a frontier. We're filled up with people. People have gone west. They've established farms. They've established factories. You know, we don't need any more immigrants. We used to, but now we don't need any more. There's no more frontier in America. 1910. So people started thinking, maybe we really don't need all these people, these unwashed hordes of people who don't speak English. Maybe we don't really want them in the cities. So restrictions started to be applied to these people. And the shibboleth was national security. Immigrants over the age of 16 had to demonstrate reading comprehension in any language. They couldn't be illiterate. There was a rumor going around at the time that you had to speak English or they wouldn't let you in the United States. And that really was never true. You had to be able to speak your own language and read your own language and write it, but you didn't have to know English. And then new immigrants were levied a higher tax. And then 1921 to 1930, this was after the Great War, and there was a Quota Act. And this is very complicated. It was set at a percentage of the people who came in. First it was like 1910. So we have all these people, and we have a list of their ethnic groups and their races. So how many Slovaks came in? How many Ruthenians came in? So we're going to set the current the current stats based on 3% of each of these groups that had already been identified. And then the total number of visas each year was set at 550,000. But no quotas were put into place for residents of the Western Hemisphere, which means that people who were from England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany actually, were okay, because they had come in larger numbers before 1910, and they were all right. And then 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, which was really punitive, reduced the annual number to 2% of the number of people in 1890. So most of the Irish, had come in, large numbers of Irish and English had come in before 1890. So they were given free rein. They could come in at any time, but it was increasingly hard to get a visa if you were from Southern or Southern Europe. Now this is interesting. Okay, the Department of Justice defined these as the different races. When we look at that, the Irish were considered a separate race, as were the English. There was the English race and there was the Irish race. Northern Italians were a different race from Southern Italians. And on passenger tags, they were listed simply as North and South. And you were considered South if you were from Naples or Sicily, Sardinia, any of the islands, Malta maybe, off the coast of Italy. But if you were north of Rome, you were considered Northern Italian, and sometimes just north. This, what happened here, this says Norway, Denmark, and Sweden down here below Lithuania. See, they were all called Scandinavians, even though they spoke different languages. Scandinavians were like one race. And the Scotch, which they called them Scotch, but they were Scots, and Welsh people were considered two separate races, apart from the English and Irish. So if you lived in the UK, you could be of the Scotch race, you could be of the Welsh race, you could be from the English race, or you could be from the Irish race. They made that very strange distinction. And then, until 1883, there were few laws restricting entry into the U.S. You didn't need a passport to get into the U.S., although a lot of the countries required an internal passport, especially in Eastern Europe. So if you were traveling from Poland to Hungary, chances are you needed an internal passport. But it didn't matter in the United States. And literacy was not a hindrance to entering the country until 19-whatever. If you looked like you were really poor and you didn't have a job, they weren't going to let you into the country unless you were healthy enough and they might offer you a job. Now, there's a guy out in Haverford who needs a gardener. Would you like to live out there for free room and board and get $10 a month? Sure. I don't want to go back to Ireland or Scotland. Sure, I'll take a job. And they had sort of an off-the-road employment agency with the steamship lines. We're looking for somebody who will work for $10 a month and put them up in the barn. And if you see anybody who's interested, like to interview them. And they would just offer, the steamships would just, the companies would just offer them the job right on the spot. Some stayed in Philadelphia, and others here were only here for a few hours. Every couple of hours, trains left, going to north, south, and west. And it was because the front of the Immigration Bureau and the whole area, the whole immigration station, was in fact a train depot because it was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And then the railroad advertised very heavily in Europe. They said they were one day closer to the west because the railroads ran right through the Appalachians, and one of the other railroads did. So you could get to Chicago. You could be there in 4 days. It would take 4 days to get to Chicago. It would take 2 days to get to Harrisburg. I don't know. That's a strange one. But they were advertising, only 2 days to Harrisburg. If you came in through New York, you could get to the Midwest by taking the Erie Canal, which took a lot longer. It was closer to get to the United States if you came into Ellis Island. It took a day longer to get to Philadelphia. But if you were going west, it was closer to go to the west. So once you got into America by way of Philadelphia, you were able to take a train, and it was much easier to go out west. And this was the Pennsylvania Railroad. And this is from a 1955 map, but it hadn't really changed substantially since the 1890s. Now look at all the places they went. They went all the way out to Wisconsin. And they ran down also to New Orleans because there were a few people who came into Pier 53 and their destination was New Orleans, and the train ran directly down to New Orleans. The American Steamship Line advertised 1 day closer to the west. There were people who wanted to come to Philadelphia rather than Ellis Island, and there were a number of reasons. One was it's closer to the west. If you want to go out to Scranton, it's closer. But it was also thought, there was a rumor, especially in Eastern Europe, that it was easier to get into America if you came into Philadelphia than it was Ellis Island. In Ellis Island, there were people asking all kinds of questions, and you could more easily get into the U.S. if you came in here. And for many of the people coming from Europe, there was already an established population in Philadelphia. You know, the Jews had established a Jewish quarter. It was actually a Jewish quarter here from the 1800s. The Irish had been established here. The Germans fought in the Revolutionary War. The Irish were servants to the Quakers. The Quakers actually used native Irish as their servants. You know, that's in the 17th century, late 17th century. So the Irish had been here for a long time. The Swedes had been here for a long time. The Dutch. So there were established religious groups and ethnic groups within the city already. And this is a long read, but it's from Dennis Clark's The Irish in Philadelphia. And he talks about why Philadelphia, because land prices were lower, more easily dispersed, cheap available land. There was an industrial boom. In the middle and last decades of the 19th century, they absorbed thousands of impoverished Irish immigrants as well as other immigrants. It's unique among the older big cities, not developing a political machine controlled by the Irish. The Irish led the way to constructing that network of schools and churches and fraternal societies and neighborhood alliances. Plus, you know, I was told that people who worked on the docks in the early 1900s were not segregated by class or by ethnic group, whereas there was a problem in New York and a lot of the other ports. That didn't happen in Philadelphia. There was a policy among the crew bosses not to pit the Magyars against the Slovaks. You don't do that, because we're all in this together, and we're all going to work together. So it was a lot easier to be a dock worker in Philadelphia than anywhere else. The ones who stayed, it was already an establishment of population. Ethnic groups tended to settle in neighborhood enclaves, which was true up until about 50 years ago. Plenty of work. A few of the immigrants went back home. 72% of Italian immigrants went back. But they didn't go back permanently. Most of them came back with family members. They went back, they worked here very hard. They got some money, they went back, they gave money to their family, and they brought family members over. So you see Italian immigrants coming in like 2 and 3 times, bringing family members. Interesting, you know, we live in South Philadelphia, and there's the Italian market, which is within walking distance of where we live. When Italian immigrants were coming in the 1890s, there were these Italian enclaves around what is now the Italian market, and there were boarding houses. And you would look at the population of the boarding houses with all these Italian names, and all the men were between like 17 and 34. And they all lived together in this boarding house, high-density boarding house. Because they came here, they were sort of taken care of by the local Italian population. They were given jobs. And then many of them didn't stay. You know, they went back. Well, when they came back to all the summer. And then, of course, they became Americanized. The Italians changed their names. I'm working with a family now, what is it, in Karetnik. They were Lithuanian Jews, Karetnik. That was the closest spelling in our alphabet for Karetnik with some other. And they changed the name to Cohen, which is, I think, the most common Jewish surname. So try finding something. This guy had just applied for citizenship, and he said, I'm changing my name from Karetnik to Cohen. I went, okay. So his name was Cohen from that time on. Or they spelled the name differently. One of the women in this film that we just did, her name was, what's her name? Harriet Mishkin. Mischkin. But her family said, no, we're going to spell it without the, we're just going to spell it without the C. It's okay, from now on it's Mishkin. Okay, so my name is Mishkin, but my grandfather's name was Mischkin. The Irish, the English, the Scots, they're pretty easy to track down because the names don't change that much. Sometimes the pronunciation sounds a little funny. But somebody was telling me that one of their parents' names was Fitzgerald, which is simple. It's Fitzgerald, right? Somebody spelled it Pitzgerald with a P, like with the Greek spell. The children of immigrants were bilingual, naturally. The parents spoke Hungarian, they spoke English and Hungarian. And they tended to be better educated than their parents. And this is part of the American experience, which is kind of funny. You get these people coming, they're starving. They live in Italy, in southern Italy. There's a famine, there's no food. They come to America and their sons open Italian restaurants. You have Jewish families who were forbidden to go to school. They weren't allowed in any of the schools. They weren't allowed to practice their religion. They come to America and they have revenge like you wouldn't believe. Their sons and grandsons become doctors and lawyers and scientists, and they open these little synagogues, in the neighborhood. Like, you're not going to do that to my family. This is a great picture. This is St. Philip Neri, which is a church in South Florida. It's right near us. I don't know when this was taken, but I would make a guess that it was 1919 because of the length of the women's dresses. The dresses were becoming longer, or short. Well, they were shorter because they didn't go all the way down to the floor. They were above the knee. And the dropped waist is spring 1919. But they're all waving American flags. And there's a couple of tricolors in there too. So I don't know whether they're Irish, Italian, or French. But it looks like it's right after the end of the First World War. Just love that picture. Look at that. Proud Americans. Okay, so in 2008, the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation decided there would be a master plan, and they were going to rework the waterfront. And when they sent workers here, there was a guy who was running a backhoe, and he said, "Oh, I'm an O'Neill. Oh, my grandfather came in on this pier. Oh, well, my husband's family came in on this pier. Well, I'll be darned, that's the immigration pier." I did show you this, didn't I? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Now New City people are arriving by airplane. And the Irish, German, Russian, Lithuanian immigrants have been supplanted in the neighborhood by more recent arrivals from Asia and Mexico. There's still an Italian neighborhood, a German neighborhood. There's a Lithuanian church in South Philly, in South Florida. And Pensport, where we are, is still has sort of an Irish flavor. The Irish bands and Irish mummers, and it's still pretty heavily Irish. But on New Year's Day, I live right on 2nd Street, which is where all these mummers clubs are. And on New Year's Day, everybody comes back to the mummers clubs and they celebrate. And I was talking with one of my neighbors who lives literally around the corner, and he's obviously Asian. And we got into a conversation watching all these mummers coming by and drinking beer. And I said, "So where are you from?" And he said, "Oh, I was born in Northeast Philly." And I said, "Yeah, but where are you? What's your ethnic?" He said, "Oh no, my grandfather is Vietnamese." He said he fought in the Vietnamese War, and he came here to the United States. And then he said, "This is my wife. She's the daughter of Cambodian refugees." And what's your name? He said, "My name's Brian Obam." So O-B-A-M. He said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm friendly with some of my Irish neighbors." And they said, "Obam, oh, that sounds like an Irish name." And they made me an honorary Irishman. I said, "You like being an Irishman?" He said, "I love America!" And this is, Pier 53 is slowly becoming recognized again for its historical significance. And these are school groups now visit the park, and I give them the passenger tags that you have. And the kids from Germantown, France, 3rd graders, dress up as immigrants, and they're more likely to be of African descent, Cambodian, people who never came to America by ship. But, they give them a tag, and suddenly they become, "You are a 24-year-old joiner from Italy. Deal with it." Now you were standing in exactly the same place where this person stood. you are that person. They go, wow! They get really excited about it. So, how is your family's immigrant experiences similar? And it turns out that there are a lot of similarities. They suddenly become aware of what immigration means, but it's through someone who's already been there and stood right there on that spot. Now, there's a documentary that's been made, and it was on the hard drive, and we left the hard drive at home, unfortunately, otherwise I'd be able to show it to you. It's called Pier 53, They Came, They Stayed, and it was filmed at the pier in 2020, and its official release is going to be on Channel 12, April 26th at 7:30 p.m. So if you want to see it. It is available on, you know what I could do? I could send, Linda, where is she? Linda, did I send you the link to the film? I didn't, I will. And you can put the link on the website so that people can just hit the link and it will go to my Google Drive. It's like a 270 meg file. It's an 8.5 minute documentary. And I couldn't put it on the computer, and I forgot the hard drive that it was on. But it's a really nice film, and we got a grant to do it through Scribe Video, which is a place out in West Philadelphia. And it's run by this fellow who got a MacArthur grant in the 1970s. He came up with the idea of making available to community groups video equipment and tape recorders, and have them go out into the community and document the history of a neighborhood or a place. And the series is called Precious Places. It usually concentrates on a place like a graveyard or an old school or just a monument, something like that. So I filed a grant to get a grant, and they said, well, yeah, Pier 53, that sounds like a precious place. Overlooked. It had to be overlooked. It's not a famous place. It had to be something nobody knew anything about. So we worked with a couple of people, and we got access to camera equipment. Because COVID came in, we couldn't actually get a hands-on demonstration of how to use Sony cameras. So we had to sort of figure it out. And there were 5 people originally part of the group, and 3 of them dropped out because of COVID. A woman who's actually has done documentaries. I've never done a documentary, nor has my partner. She had 2 small children. She had a full-time job, and she had a part-time teaching job. So she had to stay at home. She couldn't leave the house. So she couldn't be part of this. So we pieced this thing together, and we can't go to any place and have people be interviewed because nobody wants to be in a sequestered place. We'll take them out to the park and just pose them someplace in the park and set up a microphone with a 6-foot distance, and we'll record them that way, and that's what we did. And it turned out well. We got all these people in the neighborhood that didn't know that their grandfathers had come in on Pier 53. There were 2 women whose fathers had come in. They were the daughters of people who had come into Pier 53. One had come in from Germany, and he joined the American Army and fought the Germans in France. And his mother was distressed. She said, "You'll probably be killing your cousins." He said, "I don't care." Spoke German. The other was a guy from Belarus, and that was the Mishkin. That was the woman whose family had taken a letter out of the name. She was there. That was her father. One of the women, Sandy Rothman, has the greatest story. Her grandmother was Ruthenian. She was considered of the Ruthenian race, but she was from Ukraine. And her mother left at 17. She was illiterate. She had an arranged marriage. She came out to Harrisburg somewhere, and the family worked in a coal mining area. I think there were grocers or merchants or something. She married this guy, had a bunch of kids. Her brother and her husband died during the flu epidemic. She was left with a bunch of kids. She married this other guy, had 5 kids, and she lived in South Chester, I think, south of Philadelphia. And she ended up having grandchildren who graduated from college. She couldn't read. Well, right. After she died, one of her grandsons graduated from Harvard with a degree in Ukrainian studies. And the grandson and his mother went to Ukraine and they found all the family. And they found out what had happened to them because it had come under Soviet influence, and that her mother's 4 sisters had been killed at Auschwitz. They didn't know why. They weren't Jewish. They didn't know why they were killed. So, this incredible story. And going back, she said, it's like going back in time. We interviewed her for film, but we could do like a half an hour interview just with Sandy Rothman. But she's on the film. If you went in, if you see the film, she's there and she has a lot to say. So the peer group, all right? I'm a member of the peer group. This is my t-shirt. The peer group consists of people who are direct descendants of people who came in on the Pier 53. So if any of your ancestors came to America by way of Pier 53 in Philadelphia between 1876 and 1926, I invite you to tell your story. You could become a member of the peer group. And you get a t-shirt. And I collect your story, and I put it on the back of these passenger tags. And they get distributed to people like you who are interested in history, and they get distributed to the 3rd grade class of Germantown Friends, little kids who, never heard of an Italian joiner before. And this is our website. It's easy to remember. It's WashingtonAvenueGreen.com. This is what's up there now. This is the top of the splash page. This was taken a few weeks ago in the snow. And many thanks. So a whole bunch of authors, courses, and share their family stories. So that's it.